Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, April 5th, 2023. We are in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 11. Let's start with verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Let's pause there for a moment. This is continuing the story that started with the Ammonites at the beginning of chapter 10. They unnecessarily caused a war by embarrassing the ambassadors that David sent when there was a change in king, and he had been an ally with the old king. His son turned out to be a fool and despised the ambassadors and embarrassed them. And when the Ammonites realized they had embarrassed the ambassadors and the Israelites would be mad at them, they hired Armenians, and Joab went out with the army and he won that battle. And this was basically the standing professional armies of those several countries. There's actually about 6 countries involved. And then the Armenians, who are trying to build an empire, they can't stand having lost a battle, even if it was mercenaries turning tail, because it wasn't worth the money. And so they mobilized everybody, not at the time you'd go to war, and they got defeated. And now it is the next spring. It's when you actually are supposed to go to war. And that's the import of this time when it says in the spring, the time when kings go to war. It's been the policy for probably a millennia or more for armies to fight in the spring, in that pause point in the agricultural cycle after the crops are planted and before it's time to weed and everything else that you do during the warmer parts. And there was a time in there where you could go to war and engage in warfare and you weren't going to be too busy. And so this was the time. So David sent out to go finish his war with the Ammonites. Except David didn't go with the army. He sent Joab with the army, and he stayed in Jerusalem. There's several possibilities. One is he was having to do more legal things, more governing the country kind of things, managing the bureaucracy, things like that. Kings do have to do that. There's also a hint, and it comes in chapter, I think it's 21. It's several chapters later because there's a whole bunch of story that happens between now and then, and a lot of detail. And honestly, from here for many chapters, it's going to be the continuation of what starts here in chapter 11. And we're going to have to get into that bit by bit. It's a big, complicated story, lots involved, and we learn a whole lot more about David in the process. It could be that he was getting too old to be a good soldier. We get, I think it's in chapter 21, as I've mentioned, he goes out to war, and one of the people fighting him, and I believe it's the Philistines, started to get the best of him. And somebody came to his rescue and killed the guy. And then his soldiers made him promise to never go back on the battlefield. He was too old to fight. And they didn't want to lose their king in a battle just because he got too old to fight. And so he promised and he never went back to battle. It could be that he was feeling his age here and already. Since this is not chronological, and indeed, there's lots of things that say this is not chronological, he could have already been getting to that age when he shouldn't have been out on the battlefield. Let's face, hand-to-hand combat is a young man's game. It is not for the old. If the old are fighting, it's because things are getting desperate. And David was a very good soldier, but even at that, as he aged, he would have gotten to the point where he couldn't fight anymore. And it may have been that his personal opinion is, I'm not fit for the battle. We don't need the whole army. We don't need Joab will motivate people. He's wise in battle. He can do the job. I'm not needed there. There are things of statecraft here in Jerusalem that need to be done. You know, there's good, legitimate reasons why David wouldn't go to battle. There may have been some crisis in the governance of the country, and he needed to be there to be at court, to have the hearings or whatever. That's not mentioned. It's just he did not go out with the army. And Joab is taking the army, and he's going to go defeat Ammon, the country of Ammon, and the Ammonites. And he has actually done that here in the first verse. He's defeated the whole country, and everybody that's left is in the capital of Rabbah. And their capital was Rabbah, and he is besieging the city. Now, besieging the city can take a long time. Most sieges in that day and time lasted a few months, but they could last a whole lot longer. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD actually lasted about 2.5 years. And it was not the longest siege, but it's probably the most famous long siege. There were sieges in that lasted dozens of years. Their sieges normally lasted just a few months before somebody figured out how to negotiate a settlement or somebody won the battle somehow. By the time that Babylon comes around, sieges have become to be a big deal. But at this point in time, they're not as big a deal. Very often, when countries got to where they were besieging a walled city, they would quit. Say, hey, we've won the war, let's negotiate a peace that has both sides save face. We're not out to defeat everybody. But Ammon had so poked their finger in Israelites' eye with how they treated the ambassadors, and then called up the Armenians, and they've had 2 battles that year since the last time that kings go to war. You don't just casually negotiate. You're going to defeat the Ammonites and teach them that that was stupid. And so they're going to besiege the capital, and they're going to try to starve them out. And they have basically killed the countryside at this point in time. The Ammonites were some of the people that God said to destroy them. They have their own country still. And David, by this point in his career, knows what Moses says, knows what Joshua says. He's had people read the books of the law to him, if he's not read them himself, and he knows that God says wipe these people out. So he's got the opportunity, he's got the political will, the country is up to it, he knows it's viable. And so, obey God, get it done. He doesn't start the war of aggression just go out and let's wipe everybody off the map the way they had earlier. But he also trusts that God caused this young king to be a fool because God wants to wipe him out. And he's trusting that God will use these circumstances. And as such, he doesn't think he's required on the battlefield. So he stays in Jerusalem. This proves to be a bad mistake, but it's not obvious when he starts. Verse 2. One evening David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanliness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." A little bit about architecture. What's going on is they had flat roofs on their houses. And when it began the time of year when it began to get too warm to sleep indoors, they would then move up to the roof at night and sleep. Their spring is kind of like our spring. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, it's been cold. It's been less than 2 weeks since we had frost at our house. So we had frost on the grass. And yet, today was nearly 90 degrees. It will probably still get cold once more time, but not probably freezing before it gets hot and stays hot. We have had this spring several instances where we got up into the 80s and got back down to freezing. And that is the time of year when kings go off to war. So David couldn't sleep in the house. Apparently it had gotten warm, and he was going up on the roof to walk around, cool off, or it's the fact that he was concerned about statecraft and it was late and he couldn't sleep because he was worrying about some problem, a governmental problem that he was having to deal with, or something like that. There's all kinds of explanations, but it was common practice. Instead of disturb everybody in the household, if you couldn't sleep, you went up on the roof. And he was basically pacing. Of course, the palace is probably one of the tallest buildings in Jerusalem. It's probably built on, it was built on one of the highest hills in Jerusalem. And he looks over the roof and he sees a woman taking a bath. And she's beautiful. Now, he probably can't see a whole lot of detail. If it's night, she's probably expecting darkness to hide her. There's not a lot of illumination. He's not seeing a lot of detail. He is a man that's used to seeing at night, and some people see better at night than others. He's used to being out in the field. He's probably able to tell that she's naked. But the culture was also one that was, Middle Eastern. Women didn't show a lot of their bodies. A lot of American fashion would probably be scandalous in that society that David lived in. Women were probably not as covered up as Muslims make them to be today, but they were used to being not very exposed. Now, within the household, they possible. But here she was taking a bath, so she was completely naked. He was probably not used to seeing that. Even within the household, when he had one of his wives with him, he was probably not used to seeing his wives completely naked. That was just not done because in the household, you had a bunch of people around. Everybody knew who was having sex with who because the house isn't that big, and if nothing else, all the women know who's missing and who's with their husband, or not their husband, but somebody else. You didn't, people knew, particularly in the king's household. Everything the king does is important. The scribe doesn't record every little thing like one of the French kings had until he realized the scribe was literally keeping somebody at the king's door and recording when the king had sex with his wife and concubine and the married woman he was having an adulterous affair with, and stop that. But, he was kind of a vain king and did it. It's kind of an interesting historical side note. But it was common for people to know what's going on in the king's household. The servants knew, and they would maintain privacy for the king, not tell everything they know. But so consequently, they didn't get completely naked to have sex. And he didn't get to see his wives that way. So when he sees, even if he doesn't see a whole lot, he sees a naked woman. And she is comely of form. And he's curious. He wants to interview her. And she's an Israelite woman. We know her lineage. She is married to Uriah the Hittite. Now, Uriah the Hittite, we'll find out later, several chapters later when we get to David's mighty men, that he is one of the mighty warriors that is renowned in battle. He is a Yahweh worshiper. He is married into Israel. Now, the Hittites were some of the people that God said, get them out of the land, dispossess them, but didn't say to wipe them out. They had the practical idea that if you worshiped Yahweh and you supported the government and you were willing to be a Yahweh worshiper and support the government, then we'll accept you like you're an Israelite, and we're not going to racially discriminate against people. And David had him promoted. He was an important man in the army. And he had married an Israelite woman. Their children would have been considered Israelites. We have some evidence that he worshipped Yahweh. So David accepted and encouraged people to worship Yahweh. If you're going to be part of my army, part of my important people, he apparently did not tolerate going and worshiping some other gods. I mean, if you're going to do that, just leave. If you're a foreigner and you're going to worship your gods, just go. He didn't need you. If you're going to support this government, and we find some other evidences of it when there's a plague and David has to stop the plague. The angel of the Lord, the death angel, is standing on the threshing floor of a Jebusite, and David buys the threshing floor and oxen to sacrifice and wood to make burn on the altar, and the sacrifice there on the threshing floor stops the plague. So, but that man worshipped Yahweh, and the conversation that it's obvious that he worshipped Yahweh. So David had made Yahweh worship common in the land, and even people who weren't Israelites were worshiping Yahweh. And Uriah the Hittite was one of these, and he was obviously a supporter of David and the government. He's an important military person. He probably had been marching with David since the days when David was running from Saul. And so David trusts him. They've been to battle together. And he's been a reliable person. So he is a supporter of David. Thing is, David sends this servant, and it's said it's a man, that, you know, this is Bathsheba, and tells who her father was and who her husband is. And then Bathsheba comes in to interview David. David interviews her, finds out who she is. This is probably not the same night. It's probably the next morning when David sends the servant out to find out who this was. And it's probably later in the day or a few days later. You know, we tend to think of things very instant because we have cell phones and we can call anybody at a moment's notice. And, you know, we can look things up on the internet and find instant access to information. It may have been several weeks for David to find who this was. But the implication here from several things is she came quickly. She wasn't trying to hide. She was not innocent either. She would have known that the taller houses around could see into her, essentially, bathtub. And that she was exposed. She was counting on nobody being up and around. But when the king himself calls for her, she's attracted. Women tend to be attracted to people of power and authority and wealth. And for the Israelite society at that time, David the king is the most powerful, most worthy, maybe even the most wealthy. We don't know for certain. Wealth was not David's purpose, but he would have been accumulating wealth. But, you know, the perception would have been he's the most important, wealthiest man in the land. And, you know, who seduced whom is not said. But the servants knew it happened. They may have maintained their privacy and maintained David's reputation with people. But they knew. The man who found out and told David would have known. The servants that brought her into him would have known. The servants that were doing the household work while the two of them were having their tryst knew. There was no such thing as privacy the way we think of privacy. The king's house, the palace, rooms were probably smaller than we're used to here in America and closer together. And he may have had several hundred people living in his palace. At least a handful of people would have known exactly who's in with David and what's going on, could hear it. And The rumor mill within the palace would have been just going. I don't expect that by, you know, a week later, but what all the servants in the household have at least heard a version of the gossip of what went on. Thing is, when a woman purifies herself from her menstrual cycle and she was able to be touched and able to have sex again, God had arranged that so that was one of the most fertile times in her period. God had promised that if they would follow all the laws, they would be a fruitful people. And then he gave them this law that you can't have sex with your wife for 2 weeks, or, you know, during her cycle, the week of her period and then the week after, and then she has this purification rite and she bathes. Well, if you're the husband and you've been denied your wife for 2 weeks and now you can, what's going to happen? Yeah. Oh, and let's face it, if women wanted the sex too, which a lot of them do, she wanted her husband. She'd been denied him for 2 weeks. Well, her husband's off to war with the Ammonites who are being fools. And he's doing his job and all that. And she appreciates that, but hey, the king's called her. So they have sex at her most fertile period of time. And she went back home. She could pretend nothing happened. David could pretend nothing happened. She's supposed to start her period in about 2 weeks. She's late. Well, a few days late, you don't panic yet. Everybody knows it moves around a few days, even if you're normally fairly regular. But then there's signs, and the people that are really observant of people can very often tell somebody has gotten pregnant, even just a few days after a woman is late for her period. And let's face it, Bathsheba, wife of one of the most important soldiers in David's kingdom, he would have been a wealthy man. He would have had a decently wealthy household. They would have had servants. She would have had people with her. They had a household. There's people there that would know and look at her and say, "You're pregnant." And some point in time, she knows herself she's pregnant. If she was already a mother, which is very likely, she would know the internal signs and the internal feel and know it for herself as well. And when she becomes convinced, her household knows Uriah hadn't been here. Bathsheba had sex with somebody. And it doesn't take people long for the rumor to get around and they figure out who it is. So she sends a messenger to David and says, "I'm pregnant." They have a problem on their hands. How do they hide this? David's not supposed to have had an affair with her. She's not supposed to have an affair with him. How do we handle this? How do we cover this up? They have no knowledge of abortion. He can't quietly call in an abortionist and the child doesn't exist. That's just not physically possible. They don't know how. It's not even a concept. And they would have had the value that all children are important. You know, does she give birth and then take the baby to David and say, he's yours, raise him? Does she, you know, verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite, and Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to David, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. What David has done is say, well, he's been on the battlefield. He's not had access to his wife. Let's bring him home. Let him have, R&R from the war. Send him down to his house. Let them have sex. And then he can think the baby's his. And, we'll pretend I never got her pregnant and this is Uriah's child and everything will be fine, right? And so David calls him in and asks about, things that he needs to know about how the battle's going, how the general Joab is, and how Uriah is, and how the war is going. And he gets his war report. Thing is, Uriah did not come by himself. He came with a retinue of people. There were some soldiers. There were people that were messengers that went back and forth between Jerusalem and the battle with some degree of regularity. And you don't send one man traipsing across the countryside by themselves, particularly somebody important. You'll send a guard with them, somebody that carries supplies, cooks food, etc., keeps the animals, and it becomes a group of servants with Uriah. And they're sleeping at the entrance to the palace. That's just the custom at that time. And they're put up in the courtyard. The king's going to provide feed for the animals, going to provide food for the people. They're basically camping in the king's courtyard. Well, Uriah does not go down to his house and enjoy his wife. He stays with the servants. David sends a gift to his house, but Uriah didn't go with the gift. So Bathsheba has this gift and going, why do I have a gift from King David? And Uriah is staying in the courtyard of the palace. It's going to be obvious to everybody that knows Uriah that he didn't go to his house and have sex with his wife. So when everybody finds out she's pregnant, they're going to know he didn't do it. Verse 10, then David was told, Uriah did not go home. He asked him, haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will do no such thing. I will not do such a thing. So Uriah is a very honorable man. Everybody else is having the privations that camping on the battlefield does. I'm not going to come to town and party it up. Basically what he says. I'm going to live just like I was living out in the field until I get back there. I'm going to stay a good soldier. Uriah is a very honorable man. Verse 12, then David said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. So David says, okay, fine, stay here a little while longer, rest up some more. We're continuing to do business, and then I'll send you back out to the battlefield. And in the meantime, David tries to get him to lose his resistance and quit and go home, even if it's just go home for long enough to have sex with your wife. Go to her, and gets him drunk, hoping that he'll lose his inhibitions about being a soldier still on duty if he gets drunk. And even drunk, Uriah, being a very honorable man, goes and sleeps in the king's courtyard. Plan one didn't work. Uriah is not going up to his wife and having sex, and David can't pretend publicly that the child is Uriah's. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is the fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die." David flatly gives Joab an order to have the Ammonites murder Uriah the Hittite. That's what, and he made Uriah the messenger bearer of the orders to have Uriah killed. And he's doing it with the hand of the enemy. But David is still causing it to be done. Verse 16. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in Uriah's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they could shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerub-Beshua? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebes? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him also, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" So Joab does exactly what King David wanted him to do. He uses the Ammonites to kill Uriah. He didn't do it exactly like David said to do, put him up in the front lines and then everybody run away and abandon him. Joab is smarter than that. Uriah is probably smarter than that. If everybody started running, he'd be running too. He's not so brave that he'd be foolhardy. Joab basically sends a small sacrificial group up to do the fighting, and they all get killed. Or Joab calls them back after Uriah dies. And then Joab is going to send this messenger back to Jerusalem to report on the battle and tell the status, and that Uriah was dead. And it's Joab basically communicating back to David, "I did what you told me to do, he's dead." Joab doesn't know why. Joab doesn't know whether he angered the king, what's going on, but, he's done the king's request. He's been obedient to the king. Joab is a soldier, hand-to-hand soldier. He is We've already seen that he's murdered a rival general. We'll find out he does more things like that later, and he and his brother both, and cause David a great deal of problems. He is not an honorable man like Uriah, and not a man after God's own heart like David. He is a very pragmatic, practical, point of the spear kind of guy. And he had orders to have somebody killed. He did so. He did so in such a way that he could get some sort of military worth out of this man dying. And he reports that back to David. And he gives the messenger ways to calm David down if David gets mad. Because he's apparently telling tales that David has told Joab about teaching him how to be a good general and how to fight battles and how to stay safe in battle. And these are stories that the soldiers should know. And he knows David may go off and say these same stories that he's already said multiple times because Joab's heard them so many times. He knows the story too. And he says, if when you're giving the count, David goes into this rant, stop him with Uriah the Hittite died also. The messenger doesn't know that Joab had this order to have Uriah killed and that he's done it. That would lead to rebellion in the ranks of the Israelites' army if they knew that one of their heroes had been ordered to be killed by the Ammonites and that Joab had done it. David and Joab would both be somebody that would be porous. Soldiers wouldn't trust them. Verse 22. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab said to him to say. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance to the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. So the servant, the messenger, has reported this, and in the days it takes to walk back, he's figured out, okay, Uriah dying is an important part of this message. I'm not just going to deliver it in such a way that I'll leave that part out. I'm going to put that up front and see if I can prevent David being mad at the messenger. He doesn't want David to be mad at the messenger. He's the messenger. He wants the favor of his king. He's delivering a message from Joab. And so he tells this story so that the Israelites sound brave and effective, and they just made a slight mistake in battle, and some of them died, and Uriah the Hittite is one of those. And he's from his perspective, he's delivering some sad news to David that one of his favorite soldiers is dead. Verse 25. David told the messenger, say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. So David is sending this coded message back to Joab, basically, thanks, buddy. You did what I told you to do. Now, do the rest of the job. And, if we take the city, it won't matter. If you go into battle, people die. He knows that. Joab knows that. That's been a truth known since way before David was ever born, that soldiers die when you go to war. And he's encouraging Joab to continue and do his job well, and not to grieve too much over the death of one of their good companions. And so the messenger takes it back, and we'll learn that they won the battle, but that's next week. Verse 26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Normally, time of mourning was a year. She mourns for him until she's over grieving. But it's not so long but what she's still pregnant. And David takes her as a wife, brings her to his house. He's at least trying to be honorable to her and, let people pretend, okay, she got pregnant after she came to David's house, after her husband died in battle. And this apparently was David's plan, that Uriah would die in battle and he'd marry her. And the old women count up months and go, yeah, that's not enough months, but we do know that babies sometimes are premature, and if people didn't know, they wouldn't know, and they would assume that David was honorable. At least that's what David's hoping. But God knew. And God knew what David had done. And God knew that David had conspired to cover up his sin. And it displeased the Lord. The Lord was not going to leave it this way. David was fully human. He made his mistakes. And when you do a mistake and you try to cover it up, you make more mistakes. In our society, we say when you lie, you have to lie to cover up the lie, and it just snowballs. Well, that's essentially what he's doing there. He's trying to hide one sin with another sin, and it's getting larger and larger and larger, and it's snowballing. If David had gone when Bathsheba said, I'm pregnant, and said, hey, I've done messed up, I've committed adultery, she's pregnant, it may not have gotten as big as it is. But for the next 10 chapters or so, we're going to be dealing with all the consequences of that, and those consequences then have further consequences that will take us through the end of Samuel and into the beginning of 1 Kings. And I know that when we get to the end of Samuel, we're going to go back to the New Testament. But when we come back to Kings, we're going to have to pick up and review the history basically from 11th chapter of 2 Samuel on to deal with some of the things that come up there. So remember this. This is one of those key events that causes a lot of things to happen in David's reign. And it causes him trouble and headache, and causes Solomon headache when he becomes king. And Solomon has to wisely deal with them. And lots of consequences, and the effects keep growing. David's, I can't sleep tonight, and he looks out and he sees a naked woman, and he should have gone down and gotten another wife and says, I'm lusty, let's go to it, honey, and not call Bathsheba in. But because he did, she gets pregnant, and he wants to hide that fact and not admit I committed adultery. And then he has the husband killed. And the thing is, God takes this broken situation and uses it for good. Because the son that is going to rule after David is Bathsheba's son. Not the one that she's pregnant with right now. That's part of the story. Don't want to tell too much. But Solomon is Bathsheba's son, and he's born well after this event. And he should have known what having multiple women and having multiple wives and having concubines does to a man, and all the trouble it caused his dad. Because it would have been part of his story he grew up with. But Solomon makes some of the same mistakes. He saw his dad doing it. He saw that his mother was a good mother to him and a good wife to his dad, and he didn't think anything of it. Bathsheba becoming David's wife is actually in God's purpose. Because let's face it, Jesus comes from that line of Solomon. It's not one of David's other sons. In fact, David's son Rehoboam, that is the fool that gets the kingdom split, Jesus is descended from him. So we have God working through history despite David's sin. God could have arranged for Bathsheba to become David's wife through all kinds of other means. Now, let's face it, he killed Saul, and David got to be king. And David didn't go out and kill Saul's king that became on the throne. And, David did not go out and do those things. If God had wanted Bathsheba to get married to David, Uriah the Hittite could have honorably died in battle, and it'd be him be a proper hero, not somebody sacrificed in a vain sacrifice on the battlefield. But God caused this to happen so we could learn about David's character, and we're going to learn lots about his character in this story as it progresses, and understand how even when David sins, he is still a man after God's own heart. And he has sinned, and there's consequences, but David does not abandon God, and he pleads with God, and he tries to intercede to make things better. But he's also willing to take the judgment God gives him. And he sees it as just and appropriate. And he tries to apply those life lessons to the kingdom. So even in David's sin, we see he's a righteous man. And that is the contradiction of us here on this earth, where we're sinners and we shouldn't be allowed into heaven. But God sent his very own Son to dwell with us as Emmanuel, to die for us as the Lamb of God, and then to resurrect him from the dead, so that we can know he's the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And we can put our faith in him. And we're not made perfect instantly when we have that faith. Sanctification is a process, and I've known enough people that have been striving for decades to know that sanctification is an ongoing process in this life. And I suspect that sanctification is finished at the day of judgment for the believer. The non believer, I think the day of judgment will be more of a trial and conviction. But I think for the believer, we'll have this learning experience and we'll get to be sanctified fully so that we're then not just forgiven, but made correct. What is broken in us will be healed and mended. And so we will be as we were meant to be in the beginning before Adam and Eve sinned, that we will be sinless then. That is my belief from having read Scripture and tried to put it together. It's just Frank's interpretation of things. And while the judgment day may be painful for us, because let's face it, growth and learning can be very painful sometimes. I think ultimately we'll look back on it from eternity and go, that was a really good day, because that's the day I went from being a broken sinner to being sanctified and no longer a broken sinner. Before that, I was a forgiven sinner. And that's very important, but we're still sinning. But after that, I think we will be fully sanctified and not sinning. And I look forward to that day, because I grieve when I sin and know it. And God brings it to my attention. I think David grieved here. And he tried to figure it out on his own. He didn't go to God immediately, which is one of the things we have to learn to do. And some of the New Testament writings do tell us to do that. And, you know, the sooner we do it, the less the consequences are. I'm at the point in my life where I have learned, when I realize I've sinned, immediately go to God, immediately go to those who know about it and admit, hey, I've messed up. Let's fix it. As much as we can. Sometimes there's no fixing it. Just other than admitting we've done it and seeking forgiveness. But, you know, David didn't do that. Of course, he didn't have the New Testament. He didn't have all the history of the kingdom and the prophets and the exile and the return and etc. And all the life lessons that came across that roughly 1,000 years. And he tries to do it on his own, and it doesn't work well. And it causes him a great deal of headache and heartache till, well, literally till the end of his reign. Holy Father, help us to be humble and teachable, and that when you show us we have sinned, that we won't try to cover it up, but we will turn to you in repentance and seeking forgiveness, and not try to cover up the fact that we sinned by doing more sin, but take your just and righteous punishment and let you mete out the punishment. Lord, that's hard to do. It is not something we as human beings want to do. But Lord, David learned, and by the end of his life we see him, even when he knows he's made mistakes, seeking God and seeking how to handle it, and taking the righteous judgment of God and living with consequences. Lord, Yet we also thank you that you are a merciful, gracious God, that even though Bathsheba sinned and David sinned, he used that union. You used that union to create the dynasty that would be David's, and your very own son would come from that dynasty to be the eternal king, the king you promised David would never fail to be on the throne. The fulfillment of the promise that you made at the beginning for David came through this inappropriate union. God, you are so amazing and merciful. You could have done it so many other different ways, but you chose to show us your mercy, even here. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor at Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, April 5th, 2023. Today is Sunday, April 2nd, 2023, and we had a wonderful Palm Sunday service today. I urge you to be there on Easter Sunday next week. The service, from what I know, has come together. It sounds to be a wonderful service. I know that Oscar and Bill are planning it, and from the plans I know of being in the choir, it sounds wonderful. There will not be Sunday school, but there will be an Easter egg hunt. Come bring children, your grandchildren, your neighbors' children, bring your neighbors, more the merrier, any and all. We want them to hear the gospel, and the gospel will be definitely presented multiple ways. I hope to see you there Wednesday night. If not, I'll see you here on YouTube. You have a blessed week.